This is Sarah Stewart Holland.
This is Beth Silvers.
You're listening to Pantsuit Politics,
where we take a different approach to the news. Hi there, it's Beth. We are popping into your feed with a quick bonus episode this week. Earlier this year, Sarah read and loved James Traub's biography of Hubert Humphrey called True Believer. And a couple of months ago, she sat down with him for a wide-ranging conversation. We wanted to share a bit of that discussion today that we thought was a perfect accompaniment to our coverage of the Democratic National Convention taking place in Chicago this week. In a way, this conversation is about Hubert Humphrey and the 1960s, and Sarah likes to talk about the smoke-filled rooms. But in another way, it's about the psychology of leaders and about the trade-offs and choices they make, about what motivates them and what inhibits them. So we hope this quick, rich conversation is a way of looking back in order to look forward. You might say it is an acknowledgement and example of the fact that we exist in the context of all in which we live and what came before us. Here's Sarah and James Traub.
James, welcome to Pantsuit Politics. I'm so thrilled to have you here. I talked about your biography of Hubert Humphrey so often on our podcast, it became a joke. And I said, yeah, your bingo card, because I'm going to talk about the Hubert Humphrey biography I'm reading right now. That's how much I've been talking about it.
Well, I'm very flattered to hear that.
Well, as I was reading it, I mean, the first thing about a biography of a man such as Hubert Humphrey is you forget how much of American history his own life spanned. And so you're gonna hear from FDR, you're gonna hear from Lyndon Johnson, you're gonna get all the way to Jimmy Carter, the part of the book that made me cry. And so I think that that's the first thing is you're just walking through so much of American history. But I want to start with, basically the only thing I really knew about Hubert Humphrey, which was that he was the nominee at I think you call it the chapters, the Apocalypse, right? The 1968 Democratic National Convention. So tell us about what do you think is accurate and inaccurate when people start with Hubert Humphrey in that particular moment in American history?
Well, Sarah, it's not that it's anything is inaccurate. It's just that it's so incomplete. That is, if what we know about this guy is the most tragic moment in his life and a humiliating one, because what happens is he gets the nomination at 68, but it's 1968. It's a yet more polarized and divisive moment than the one we're in today, though, in many ways analogous. And the kids hate him, and the streets of Chicago are filled with anti-war protesters, and no one can pay attention to what's going on in the hall. They watch the kids being beaten up by Mayor Daley's thugs. And so it's such a bitter moment, and he's been seeking this his whole life. He's an ambitious man, finally gets the nomination. And a few months earlier, Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. Politics just seemed sickening and tragic. And so for him to gain this prize at that moment was a terrible irony. And of course, he lost in I want to say a bitter campaign. It wasn't bitter because Richard Nixon was bitter. It was bitter because his own party was divided against him.
Right.
And that was a terribly bitter experience. So there's so much more to the man than that.
Well, and I think, what was so interesting as I was getting to the end of your book into 1968, I started Doris Kearns Goodwin's new book about her husband, Dick Goodwin, and their lives in the 60s. So I'm reading Dick Goodwin going to New Hampshire, working for McCarthy. Then he goes with Kennedy. So I'm like living with him is his experience. Then I'm reading about Hubert Humphrey, and especially, that he didn't stand in any of these primary elections, which I think is so, foreign to us. Because then you have the McGovern-Fraser Commission that changes the way we elect presidential candidates in the primaries. It takes them away from these party bosses that really gave him the nomination. So I'm reading about Hubert, reading about Dick Goodwin. And also at the same time, we're having this really interesting conversation, I think, right now about our own primary process. And, with Hubert Humphrey, I think history has painted him as getting this nomination in some undemocratic way. And it's so fascinating. I wanted to ask you so much, what do you think about this conversation happening now? Well, maybe that was not a bad way to pick candidates. Maybe we should go back to that. Maybe we should get rid of the McGovern-Fraser Commission's recommendations and go back to the delegates.
Well, now that's an interesting question. So, Sarah, as you say, there are important thinkers. I think of Jonathan Rauch, for example, at the Brookings Institution, who says we need a new vetting process. We need to have adults in the room. We need to have guardrails, the kind of guardrails that once upon a time prevented a Charles Lindbergh, from getting the nomination, or a Henry Ford.
A celebrity, if you will, if we really wanted to press that metaphor down.
Right, a crackpot celebrity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a hard question, because the same vetting process would have vetted out not only Jimmy Carter, who you mentioned, but Barack Obama.
Right, that's a good point.
We have this peculiar system, which unlike a parliamentary system, where you rise to the top of the party wins, the party then chooses you as prime minister. Ours is this beauty contest. It has been, I don't know, depends how you want to date it, but I would say probably from the time of, let's say, I don't know, Martin Van Buren or something. It's not for the most dignified man. It's for the person who rallies the public best. So yeah, that's what we wind up with. The pathos of Hubert in that regard in 1968 is all the people who were passionate, idealistic, moralistic, Dick Goodwin, those people, they had their candidates, Gene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy. Who does Hubert belong to? Those middle-aged, jowly guys with the cigars inside the Chicago amphitheater. George Meany, the head of the AFL-CIO, and Dick Daley, the mayor of Chicago. And there were still city bosses in those days, which meant that you were simply the head of the Democratic Party in a big city. He had known those guys forever. And owing to these great forces in the 60s caused by the war and race, there was this terrible divide. And people like Dick Goodwin, who had been Humphrey's great friends, the activist wing of the party, he was their man. They loved him in 1960. Well, then he became vice president to Lyndon Johnson, who was despised. And so those men like Dick Goodwin, often with great sadness in their heart, stood up against Hubert Humphrey, a man whom they had so admired in the past.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting to me. As I was reading your book, and it was such a great moment because Doris Kearns Goodwin lit up when I said I was reading a Hubert Humphrey biography along with her book, because she was like, oh, that's so interesting. Because, she understands, obviously, his role and this journey he went on. And so often in history, it feels like these figures, these names we know are in the right place at the right time. But man, it's hard to feel like he wasn't always a little behind. He was just a little late and they were changing the rules on him. I was so struck by the post-Watergate campaign finance reforms and how these rules he was following, they suddenly changed and he got painted in this way that it seemed unfair. And in the sort of same journey with civil rights, he's at the leading edge, and then he in pursuit of these ideals. Your book is called The True Believer. He rises to these rungs of political power thinking oh, now I can accomplish these things. And in some ways you can say he did. He was the vice president and was instrumental in this passage of these landmark civil rights legislation. And then at the same time, then the Vietnam War and his support of that and his working for Lyndon Johnson, although I struggle to use that language because it feels like, I don't know, Lyndon Johnson didn't get the memo that he was working for Lyndon Johnson a lot of the time.
Lyndon Johnson wanted a puppet, it turns out, not a vice president.
Oh my God. And that's what was so, again, that's reading these two in Congress together. I'm like, man, which Lyndon Johnson am I going to believe here? But I think it was true. And it's true of Hubert Humphrey too, right? He is a true believer. And also he was this political animal. And
I think your point about time passing him by, the 60s changes everything.
Yes.
And so a guy like Gene McCarthy, who was a very cryptic, odd character, really a philosopher who didn't really believe in politics.
That, you know what, that portrayal was consistent no matter where you were at. Everybody was like, what a weird dude.
Yeah. But so a guy like that, when Hubert was growing up, that's not what a politician was, right? Politicians, they love the bandwagon and they pressing the flesh and all. That's the world that made Hubert. And Lyndon Johnson was the same world, right? He was born 3 years prior to Hubert. Hubert's 1911, LBJ's 1908. But McCarthy's just a little younger, but that's not the point. He had this cool persona. He had this profoundly ironical manner. Hubert didn't have a grain of irony or cool. He didn't have any of that. And he seemed like a perfectly suitable guy in 1960. But here's someone who calls his wife Ma, and she calls him Pa. I mean, he's so out of sync with this moment.
You feel bad for him. I felt sincere angst for him bumping up against these different momentums in history. How much do you think media played a part in that? How much do you think sort of television and this changing culture? He tried. I mean, I thought the part about him dying was his hair was so painful. It was so painful.
So he tries. So after he loses in 68, I'm sure everyone's saying, Hubert, get with it. And so he tries so hard. He loses a little weight. He lets his hair grow almost to his collar. He dyes it in the color that people say looks like, a Cordovan shoe polish. And it's just, there can't be a new Hubert. There just wasn't. It was like the new Nixon. So yes, that's part of the pathos. Now, in 1960, when he runs against JFK, that's obviously 1960 belongs to the 50s. It doesn't belong to the 60s. And so you could say, well, that, should have been Hubert's moment. But, going back to this question of why Americans elect presidents, they want a romance of some kind, or let's say we used to think. And Kennedy, of course, was a larger than life figure. He was a romantic figure. And, of course, in those days, we didn't know about all of his infidelities. We didn't know about all the medications he was taking. We just had this beautiful picture and this beautiful young wife, Camelot. And Hubert was the guy next door, your talkative druggist. And so in some ways, you could say Hubert never was made of the material that Americans seek in their presidents. In a prime ministerial system, he would have been perfect. He knew more than anybody about everything. He was an engaging, gregarious person who rises to the top of any gathering. He would have been a great prime minister. But that's not the way it works in the United States.
Well, and I think what's so interesting that he ended up as Lyndon Johnson's vice president and in this sort of partnership or this pairing and the way you think about them is, man, in the same ways those things are true, I think, of Lyndon Johnson, that, he didn't have cool, but he was, a highly capable political animal. But that tension that he had with the moment, with the culture, with the younger generations made him so paranoid. Or maybe he already was. Whereas Hubert kept this idealism. I kept being like, why you keep letting them beat you up? Aren't you going to get mean at any point in this story? But he really didn't. He never did.
Well, you know what? It had never been his nature before. All the people, it often happens, politicians who are nice guys, that the people around them become their designated haters. And so, they'll fight with guys who the candidate himself or the politician himself won't fight with. And so the people around Humphrey, they hated Gene McCarthy. They hated Lyndon Johnson. Hubert didn't. He had every reason to hate actually both of them, though, of course, Johnson was a much more central figure. When Johnson dies in 1973, Hubert is the lead eulogist, and he talks about what a beautiful experience it was for him. And when Walter Mondale in 1976 is asked by Jimmy Carter to be his vice president. And Hubert's his mentor and his great friend. And he says, Hubert, look, you had a terrible experience. I shouldn't do this, should I? And Hubert said, do it. Don't even think about it. You'll have more power than you ever had before. You have to do it. And I think for Mondale, it was a very important conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's relevant now as you see people fight for Trump's vice presidency. And you're like, why? And I kept hearing Hubert Humphrey's voice being like, no, you just got to do it. You're still going to be the vice president of the United States under any rubric.
I was thinking about that this morning, in fact, as I was reading about yet another candidate, alleged candidate, Ben Carson, whose friends were saying, Ben, don't do it. And, think about Mike Pence. Mike Pence was not quite Hubert, but squashed in the same way, and also forced to do things that he himself regarded as shameful.
Right.
Which I don't think that, that is kind of similar to Hubert now that I think about it. So, yeah, that's a poison chalice too, isn't it?
Yes. And I thought that was so interesting to sort of watch that and that light and dark of their personalities. And I think especially as you go to the end of his life, and he has this long and storied and very complicated career, to see how that he is, is held up and is embraced. I mean, again, that story with Jimmy Carter and how he took him to Camp David and on Air Force One when he never was his vice president speaks to both of them and what a good person Jimmy Carter is. But this sense that he's this lion, it reminded me of Ted Kennedy and how Ted Kennedy had become sort of a caricature, I think, to a lot of Americans because of Chappaquiddick and because of his family. But then at his death, you saw all his colleagues really saying, like, this is the man I knew. This was the impact of his life. This was the complexity and the comprehensive nature of his work and his impact through his public service.
A point about Teddy Kennedy, because that's a very good analogy. And here's the point that I think people don't recognize about either one of those two guys. They were great legislators.
Mm-hmm.
And now that word, great legislator, is an archaism because you can't be a great legislator unless you can win over people from the other side. That's right. In the Senate where you need 60 people. That's the trick. And Teddy Kennedy, for all of his, kind of people thought almost self-parodying liberal passion, was someone who the other members, the other side, they loved the guy. Orrin Hatch, they loved the guy, and they were prepared to work with him. Hubert was someone who needed to be loved and was. And, early on in the mid-50s, he writes to a friend and says, my best friends here are the Southerners. Because he found the Southerners, people who, like himself, really believed in legislating. I mean, they were Jim Crow racists, these people. And civil rights was Hubert's great cause. Nevertheless, he wanted to be part of their world. They kind of controlled the inner sanctum of the Senate, and he wanted to be in the inner sanctum, and he was. And so what this meant is that his whole career, he was building up these relationships. And finally, when there's a Democrat in the White House, John Kennedy, and then, of course, later Lyndon Johnson, Humphrey, while he's still in the Senate, becomes the whip of the Senate, is able to use those relationships to pass all this legislation that he'd been dreaming about, the Peace Corps and what was called area redevelopment, and, of course, the beginning of civil rights legislation, and then in 1964, the capstone of his career in many ways, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which arguably was the most important thing the United States Congress did, at least back to the Social Security Act, if not in the whole 20th century.
Yeah. And I thought it was so interesting at the end of his life and his career in the Senate that, when he could finally sort of lay down this running for office, he couldn't stop. It was like a compulsion, to run for office, run for higher office.
The other guy I wrote a biography about was John Quincy Adams. And Adams and Humphrey had that in common, that Adams was president. And he went back home and he couldn't bear it. And he ran for Congress. And he's the only guy to have served in the Congress after being president. And Hubert does the same thing. He goes back to the Senate after serving as vice president. He can't live without it.
Well, and that's when people get into conversations about why won't they retire. I'm like, you got to go read something like this. You have to understand the compulsion, it is. And I don't think it's necessarily, I don't want to say that with a sense of judgment because I think it is I think human beings need purpose. And when someone finds their purpose in public service, And that it's not just public service, it's politics and it's celebrity, of course. But I do think that the people who can't stop feel the impact of their work. And that is something that human beings want and need. It's not surprising that they go back to the well. But I just thought it was so interesting at the end of his life that he turned so much to sort of foreign aid and foreign development. And after working so hard on domestic issues, that this is where he, sort of followed that passion outside of the political
I would say there's sort of two things at the end of his life. So, and both have to do with people's well-being, prosperity, the economy. So one, as you say, is foreign aid. And he was, in the 1950s, when foreign aid really was a big deal in the United States, Humphrey was the most single-minded proponent of foreign aid, to, by the way, a very naive degree. I mean, he really thought that America could use foreign aid to make these countries more democratic and more pro-American, which turned out not to be so. And by the time it's the early 70s, what you were talking about, he's chastened. And he's actually thinking about foreign aid more carefully than almost anybody else in the Congress is, saying, how can we target foreign aid so as to reduce corruption, increase democracy, accountability, the things that will make governments more legitimate. So that was the foreign thing. The thing at home is really, in a way, the second stage of the civil rights movement, that he says, I lost in 1968 in part because so many working class white voters thought that what I was saying to them is, you have to sacrifice in order to make Black people whole. That's what politics is. We're going to take from you because you have too much, and we're going to give to them because they don't have enough. That's a dead end. And he understood that was a dead end. So he said, how can we find a way of thinking which shows to working class and middle class, Black and white people, what they have in common? And that was the goal of his last years in office, was full employment, good jobs, non-discrimination, but above all, employment. That was his issue. And finally, there's something called the Humphrey-Hawkins bill was passed, which is a very watered down version of his hopes for a full employment legislation.
Thank you to Sarah and James for that discussion. Thank you to all of you for listening. We'll see you again on Friday. And for everyone participating in one form or another, have the best DNC available to you.
Pantsuit Politics is produced by Studio D Podcast Production.
Elise Knapp is our managing director. Maggie Pinton is our director of community engagement.
Xander Singh is the composer of our theme music with inspiration from original work by Dante Lima.
Our show is listener supported. Special thanks to our executive producers:
Martha Brunitsky,
Allie Edwards,
Janice Elliott,
Sarah Greenup,
Julie Haller,
Tiffany Hassler,
Emily Holiday,
Katie Johnson,
Emily Helen Olson,
Barry Kaufman,
Catherine Vollmer,
Lori Ladow,
Lily McClure,
Linda Daniel,
The Cousins,
Tracy Putoff,
Sarah Ralph,
Jeremy Sequoia,
Katie Steigers,
Karen True,
Annika Uvaline,
Nick and Elisa Valelli,
Amy Whited,
Lee Shea McDonough,
Morgan McHugh, Jen Ross,
Sabrina Drago,
Becca Dorval,
Christina Quartararo,
Shannon Frawley,
Jessica Whitehead,
Samantha Chalmers,
Crystal Kemp,
Megan Hart,
The Adair family,
Jenny Francis,
Leanna Pilgrim Larson,
the Monene family,
Ashley Renee,
Michelle Palacios,
Jeff Davis, Melinda Johnston, Michelle Wood, Nicole Berkless, Paula Bremer, and Tim Miller.